Thank you, Nivedita. And many, many thanks to everybody who's here and sort of to everybody who's braving the heat here and the sultry weather and all the rest of it. And your political commitment to an issue such as this is very inspiring. I have been away from the campus for a few years. I'm thrilled to be back and to a discussion such as this. I was saying to our young friends who organized this that I would rather have been sitting here listening to all of you rather than holding forth on this and that and the other. And with luck, you will have things to say which will be sharp and incisive and make us think about many other things that we aren't probably going to be able to address today. So let me not repeat exactly the kinds of things that Nivedita raised, because many of those were things that were thoughts that I had as well. But I just want to frame this as a kind of spectrum of violence alongside histories of resistance, right? We are where we are because there have been long and very difficult histories of resistance. And all these histories of resistance, to which I shall allude to later, aren't necessarily only directed towards a legal outcome. Right? There is that, but there is the public presence of young people, young women, and in the recent Mitchell that took place in the big night, Reclaim the Night protest that took place in Calcutta recently, I heard a small interview with a 90-year-old woman who said that I am here because I want future generations of women to be able to come out at any time, anywhere, and be there. The street is theirs. And I must say that brought tears to my eyes, because women from all over Bengal, it wasn't only Calcutta, all over in the city there were protests. Right? And we have seen many, many protests. Sometimes these are social media protests, perhaps to do with the fact that there are clampdowns on protests and sort of restriction of protest sites and so on and so forth. We know that too. But there are protests against the restrictions of protests. People find new and creative forms, right? They find videographic forms of protest. There are all manners of forms of protest, and we are all formed by that. We respond to that, right? We add to that. And I think it's important to bear that in mind. But let's keep that there and come back to this business of the home, but from the point of view of the familiar. Very often when we speak about violence against women and girls, very often we don't speak about violence against girls, we speak about violence against women, and we assume that we know what that means. But I want to actually speak about something slightly different, which is natal family violence. The violence that happens in the home that you are born in. Right? And if you actually look at the data on this, you'd be surprised to find, perhaps you won't, that it is extremely high. And the reason why any of these kinds of stereotypes get formed in your mind, and if we want to put that in a spectrum along with physical and non-physical forms of violence, you will find that just as much as many things begin in the family, violence also begins there. Your first education about how to fight it, but how to be violent also starts there. Any number of young women here, or not so young women, can attest to the fact that they have been shouted at by mothers and fathers and grandmothers who tell them what to wear and when to go out and how to sit and all the rest of it, to being hit very badly, so much so that they had to be hospitalized. Right? Now this is something we want to keep with us, because very, very often when we start speaking about violence in any situation, we somehow imagine that it's somebody else out there who's doing this. These terribly horrible, bad people are out there. But the thing is, that is much harder to point a finger to your parent or to your sibling and say that this person was very violent to me, or this person intimidated me, or this person put me down, or this person humiliated me, this person made me feel nervous about inhabiting the world in the ways in which I wanted to, right? And I think that is something we want to keep with us, because when we look at generations, if we just look at a space such as the university, which is both a workplace for some of us, but it's also a residential place for many of you. It's a residential place for many faculty members also. Non-teaching staff stay here. They work here. So the university campus very often is a slightly more complicated space. One of the things that I remember, and I often go back to this, both of us remember this, is the extremely brutal attack on a first-year Korean language student on this campus by a student who was in the second year. A boy who had been stalking her for an entire year. She hadn't dared to speak about this. And the reason for that is, as Nivedita said earlier, very often you have to fight. She and her younger sister both were enrolled in Korean. They had to fight to get out of their home far away in a different state and come here to be enrolled as students. This was the first break they had had from the family. If she was to report back saying that this boy is following me and I don't like it, the chances were very high and very likely that she would be pulled back and taken back. At the end of that year, between classes, this young man attacks her. Now, there are many things about it which are horrific. For many of us for whom the university is not just a workplace, but the classroom is a deeply intimate space of engagement with students. It was actually a traumatic fact that something like this could have happened. But alongside with that, I did worry and wonder about what was it that made this guy. I mean, I didn't know at that time where I could get a katta and where I could get of course, you know where you can go and get a knife. Knives are easy enough. Knives have many purposes, as it were. But getting a saw and getting a country rifle and this and that and the other, most of us wouldn't know where to go to get them. Right? Now, it is I'm not sort of speaking only about the resourcefulness of a predator of this kind, but the fact that there is something about the atmosphere that young people grew up in, right? That makes stalking acceptable, that makes advances acceptable, that makes commenting acceptable. I spoke recently with a student of mine who said that, comments are very common. Right? Now, on a campus such as this, which has many different, you can characterize this campus in all manners of ways, and it's not unusual to this campus. A couple of months back, there was a brutal gang rape on BHU campus. And the survivor there was so brave that she actually went immediately after that to report it. But what has happened to that? It has lapsed. It's sort of fallen by the wayside. Soon after the RG Kaur attack and gang rape and murder of this young doctor, there was a gang rape and murder of a nurse in Uttarakhand. I saw. Nobody speaking about this. Right? There are innumerable such cases. But we don't have to have the height of brutality to speak about the fact that there is a certain kind of adjustment, shall we say. Not acceptability necessarily, but adjustment around. And you're always told, young women and girls are always told, adjust kar lo. And it can be adjusting to any number of things, right? You may be in a very crowded bus and you'll be told that adjust kyun nahi kar sakte, thoda hat ja, wo bhi wahan pe baithenge. From that kind of adjusting, making space for humiliation, making space for an unwanted touch, making space for a comment, right? We live our everyday lives through adjustments. Sorry, I didn't do the right thing and write things down, put my points down on a piece of paper. I did the modern thing of writing it on my phone, and now I have to keep opening it up because it's sort of shutting down. Now, in that context, to put these two things together, if we grew up in a culture of violence within the context of natal families, where we are actually taught how to accept and adjust and not make a big fat fuss about this, not complain about your brother, your father, or mother, and so on and so forth, then the chances are that you are already coming acculturated with both capacity for inflicting harm on others. Right? The first abuse that comes to people's minds are always to do with female kinds of terms. Right? Kutti and bitch and all of these kinds of things. However much one might want to reclaim it, you don't reclaim it. It's really like a wound when you hear it. Somebody yells an abusive word at you. It is hurtful. You do feel humiliated. You do feel that sort of the effects of that staying with you for a much longer period of time. And we find that on campuses too, in places where we imagine that every student who's there has come in through a kind of entrance test that allows everybody equal rights and equal access to be there, there are ways and ways of making you feel that you are an endangered minority. And that could be in the form of being a religious minority, it could be in the form of being lower caste, it certainly, across the board, is being a woman. Okay? And many women have spoken to me in recent years, since 2013. At that time, our friends on this campus had actually conducted a survey, an anonymous survey, in which it was really shocking for me to find that 1/5 of the female respondents, nobody gave their names, they just identified whether they were boys or girls. 1/5 of the female respondents said that they had been attacked by somebody they were involved with, but also with a sharp instrument. And I could not believe that I was, so it's, the numbers of cases that will reach a police station or a GS cash or an ICC or any of these kinds of very necessary institutions is far less than what is actually happening. So we are living in a situation where through acculturation and adjustment we are making our peace with different kinds of forms of violence, different kinds of forms of violativeness. And one of the questions that has come up again and again in the last decade of spectacular violence on the bodies of religious minorities is this question of how did these men who, and mostly they were men, who attack, how do they become what they are? How do predators become predators? Are we having that conversation? Is it about families? Is it about other kinds of sites? How do we speak about those who violate, right? Not just who are survivors. How do you raise your hand to hit somebody? How do you open your mouth to abuse somebody? How do you become who you are? How do you make peace with the fact that from the time when you were born, when you were just a little blob with no ideas, no nothing, no views, whatever it is, to this person, how does that transition take place? Where are the sites in which these transitions are taking place? And I think that is something all of us must spend some time, I think a lot of time, thinking about. We have to think about the sites in which these kinds of things happen. Now, Nivedita did a very helpful thing of actually breaking up and opening up questions about the key words that are used in this title to today's conversation, which I hope will be a conversation. I want to ask a question about this thing called security. She raised very pertinent but slightly different kinds of views. But in this context, in this country, if we were to speak about women, and we were to speak about those who are part of the large informal labor force, how do we speak about job security? Is that not an issue we need to speak about? Right? One of the strange things about this country, given that there's very little data being collected, we are all going by data collected by groups and other things some years back. But even if we use that, one of the kinds, you'll see a rising graph for education and higher education for girls and young women. But there is a very low labor force participation for women, right? We are, in terms of, a listing of countries and so on and so forth, we are, way below many other countries, despite being trillion and billion and God knows what kinds of economies and so on and so forth. So, what about job security? What about educational security? What does the security in relation to these kinds of things mean, and how does that transform our life? How will I change if I know that after I study I will get a job, that I will have a salary? It doesn't matter. I mean, I have worked with people in the last few years, many of whom were contract workers, who repeatedly told me that at least we have this contract job. Right? When I would say that, I'm really sad that there aren't more permanent positions, they would say, we at least have this contract job. Right? Contracts can enable certain kinds of things. I'm not saying it's ideal, but there is a question of what that monthly salary does for you, right? How it can change the everyday reality of actually inhabiting a violent space and perhaps moving away from there. Right? Now, this is a question we have to ask. We have to connect the dots. We have to, what does it mean to take control of my life? It means that I can make those decisions, and when I make those decisions, if somebody says to me, you stupid bitch, how do you dare to make this? I can say, I don't want to listen to you, and I'm going to walk out from here. Right? How can I do that? I can only do that amongst other things. I need to have friends, I need to have a support network, I need to have a bunch of things of that kind, but I certainly need to have some money of my own. Without that, I will not be able to do that. Right? So, it is important to ask that question. But having said which, we do need to remember that large parts of, women in the labor force are part of the informal economy. A student of mine is doing an absolutely stellar piece of work on women within the informal economy and the kinds of, in fact, she's the person you should be calling to speak about these kinds of things. Now, one of the things that her deeply rich ethnographic work shows us, and this is something that feminist economists who have done that kind of work speak about, is the fact that everyday forms of humiliation are what your working life is. It's structured by that. So it's not whether your workplace has certain laws and regulations, it's about what that interaction, the fact that you can be thrown out on your ear, you may lose your job. If the staff whom you're working under, if you're in a, let's say, construction site, Nivedita was asking, how do we speak about that, right? Now, if you are a woman who's carting huge amounts of very heavy bricks or a lot of, sand or whatever it is on your head for, on a construction site, and if the labor contractor standing there is actually making all kinds of comments and calling her names and humiliating her, and also sort of indirectly asking her for sexual favors, what is she supposed to do? Throw this and make sure that her entire family collapses, because very often they're surviving on this woman's daily wage that she's bringing in, right? Would she do that, or would she put up with this? And the chances are that she will put up with this, and she will put up with this and put up with this till such time as it becomes impossible to put up with this, right? So I think it is important that when we speak about these kinds of things, when we speak about safety, when we speak about security, when we speak about workplaces, I think we also want to speak about the deeply insecure nature of economic possibilities for large numbers of people. One of the things that we saw, one of the big discussions after a very long time in the context of the elections this year, was this question of unemployment. Right? But what did not happen, at least I never saw it, was this question of unemployment specifically for women. Now, we know that during COVID, when women in the informal sector lost jobs and so on and so forth, I mean, there was that big kind of the violence of losing your economic livelihood, right? But there was also an extraordinary amount of escalation in domestic violence once they went back to their homes, to their villages, and so on and so forth, and all of that, right? Now, all this some very committed, intrepid feminist scholars are researching that. They're trying to put these stories together. But we don't have it in the public domain. The unemployment discussion isn't bringing up this question of job insecurity and everything that the attendant kind of issues with that for women and what that actually means. Finally, I just want to end with a slightly different kind of thing. So, just to go back to something I started with, which is the histories of protest. I also want to say that in 1985, Nivedita and I were part of the first group of women who organized a protest on this campus. I remember that in the context, we were students at that time. There was a case of sexual harassment and sexual violence. And large numbers of students joined that protest. There were about 10 or 12 of us, women students, who got together and decided that we needed a protest of this kind. It was not done with the help of any political party, but it was done as a kind of feminist sort of challenge to the kind of everyday forms of patriarchy that we live with on campuses. So in that light, the question then is there a kind of feminist futurism? Right? Is there something we can think forward? Is there a kind of imagined future, a feminist future? Is there a way in which, when we say, is it simply a question of making sure that, the laws are implemented? Of course, those should be, to make sure that cases are taken on, that they are expedited fast, that there is necessary and exemplary forms of punishment that are actually given, so that that can actually become the deterrent. I fully agree with Nivedita when she said that if we have shouted ourselves hoarse saying the death penalty is no answer, and I saw recently apropos the doctors gang rape and murder, that now they are also saying encounter death in this kind of casual way. I mean, I'm shocked and horrified that something like this can be normalized as a kind of punishment. So I think there are things that we have to keep fighting about. But in the kind of imagined future, a kind of a possible future that we think about, how do we rethink our homes, our social lives, our workplaces, and so on? How do these become safe? But not just that, how do they become fun and relaxed? How do we manage to make both our public and private lives fun spaces to be in? Places where we feel comfortable in our own skin. Places where we don't have to explain ourselves. Places where we can come in and out at whichever time we want to give just a tiny example. To bring home friends who may not be the kinds of friends our families might want us to have. Right? To be in relationships which are not prescriptive. Nivedita spoke about marriages and the ways in which the kind of marital imaginary constrains women mostly. Non-heteronormative relationships are there all over the world and historically. But we also know that those who are in those relationships face as much violence, as much terror as women do. So what are the kinds of futures we can imagine? And I want a future in which I will be able to step out of my house. One of the nice and perhaps not so nice things of growing older is that I don't want to do the mad and completely daring things I wanted to do when I was much younger. I do want to sleep very early and so on. But if on that odd night when I'm not sleeping at 10, I do want to be able to wander out and walk down the road and go for a little stroll. I want to be able to enjoy sitting by a lake by myself. I want to be able to walk with a woman friend and sort of see certain kinds of things, to have a sense of the night and nocturnality, which I have no experience of. It does not shape my life. It doesn't shape my life, of course, because of my social location, certainly. But for those women who are in the night and who have to experience the night, they experience it with a lot of fear. Their presence there gives us hope. I remember years and years ago going to Bombay and being blown away by the fact that was before the Adani Ambani lot had destroyed the city and all their buddies. and the nature of workforce had, there were women who were going to work in commuter trains at night. I remember riding on night trains with my cousins. And I remember thinking, my God, I remember coming back to Delhi and saying to friends here, God, that is really, really liberatory. Now, is that possible as an everyday, normal, taken for granted way? If that becomes possible, then perhaps we as a society do have a future. Thank you so much.